interstellar education represents a unique challenge. And I want to define it carefully here. When I say interstellar education, right, I'm not talking about educating physicists, right, to build the machines to get there. I'm talking about interstellar education as the challenge of educating oneself once that has already happened, right? So I'm looking at it from a very far future perspective, and I'm saying, well, let's assume we already have the ability technologically to travel to other star systems. The question becomes then, under those unique circumstances, how do those circumstances impact us, to put it bluntly, epistemologically, right? How does the way that we perceive fact and fiction have to change? And it turns out that there are two really interesting aspects of this that really started my research into it. The first was that any type of technology that gets us to near star systems, whether it's Alpha Centauri or Tau Ceti, whatever it happens to be, is going to be a technology that will have to, at some level, approach light speeds to be realistic. And this is interesting because once you get into near light speed travel, you end up with time dilation effects. In other words, the flow of time changes for you as a traveler. And what that means is that whether you're going to a different star system and coming back, or going there and staying there, your traveling to other stars is also time travel. And I began looking at something which seemed very quirky, but I found quite interesting, which was, okay, if we're going to time travel, we should figure out how effectively, over the past century, we have actually predicted the future. And have we prepared, pedagogically, ourselves for the futures we imagined, right? So if you do studies of time capsules, where people put into a box or some sort of special container, predictions about the future, right? For example, there was a time capsule that was put in the World's Fair in 1939. I think it was to be opened 5,000 years in the future. But among the things they predicted, most of them didn't happen. And the same is true whenever you look at like Popular Science magazine or other magazines that predict the future, right? If we look at the Jetsons, we always use the Jetsons as the TV show to discuss failed predictions of the future, basically. And what we see is that we're not very good at this. We're actually quite bad at predicting the future. And this impacts, to a very high extent, the way that we should think about pedagogy, right? So if we're this bad at it in the situation that we know, right? So here we are in 1950 or 1939, predicting what will happen in 50 years, right? We're on Earth, we have all the tools that we need to predict how humans behave. We can't predict the weather tomorrow. We can't predict the stock market tomorrow. We can't even predict it in 5 minutes. And as a result, we have to really question the utility of standard models of education when we come up against this challenge of an interstellar journey, where it's not just that we're going into someone else's future, our own future, we're literally going to a new world. And you can pose the question, for example, if Columbus had a master's degree before he went to America, what would that degree be in? And what degree could possibly prepare him for what he saw? Would it be a degree in botany? Would it be a degree in sociology? Would he be an anthropologist? Maybe you'd have to do a little bit of all of them. And to a very high extent, Columbus traveled to an imagined world. And what we see actually, which is very interesting, is that Columbus behaved in a way that completely misinterpreted where he thought he was. And he behaved, and the way he reacted to evidence on the ground, it was based on his fictional view that he was in India and not North America. And this challenge, pedagogically, is actually quite interesting. So this is how I got involved in this.
I see. In your research, from what I know, you try to problematize the relationship between fact and fiction, and you are using the work of the famous French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu to deal with it. Could you explain briefly what's your approach to this?
I mean, if I'm correct on this, a lot of sociological discourse theory, when it looks at fact and fiction, has looked at what I would call entanglement. And entanglement, in my understanding of it, means we see it as a problem that fact, or that fiction is being construed as fact, right? So when most sociologists discuss discourses of fact or fiction, they're discussing it in a negative context. They're saying, look, for reasons of power or for reasons of the social architecture of a system, right? People have the ability to represent fiction as fact. Does that make sense? I mean, is that more or less? I mean, I think this is more or less, what most sociologists would look at.
They are relative, we can say.
They're relative, right?
The boundary between fiction and fact is relative.
So, but if the boundary is relative, right? This poses the question: what if you go the other way? Like, what if you look at it not as a negative, but as a positive? And the bulk of my research for this paper deals with the possibility that there may be situations where we need to treat that boundary differently. And instead of entanglement as a negative, where fields of power manipulate fiction as fact for their own purposes, I'm looking and saying, well, maybe there are cases where we want to academically treat them as identical. And when I say that, I'm being very specific. I am not saying that we're holding fiction as truth. I'm saying that there will be a shift from certainty as an outcome to utility. And utility is interesting, because when we say that, I mean, we find not that we're looking for something to be true, we're looking to see if something is useful.
I see. So, could you summarize briefly the results, the data, what your data shows from the paper?
What we did was a study on two things. The first was what I'm going to call science fiction leaving the literature department, right? So if you look at the history of science fiction and how it's taught in American higher education, what we see is that science fiction historically has been taught as fiction. It's been taught primarily within literature, English, and writing departments. However, since the mid-90s, there has been a slight transition that we see as significant in terms of the future. And that transition has been that science fiction has begun to leave the literature department. It's going into other fields. So we see it appearing in political science classes, we see it in environmental classes. There's even a class in library sciences where science fiction is used to discuss information control theories. And this is very significant because this idea fits very well, we see as an initial trend, that science fiction is beginning to be used in official academic contexts for its utility. It's being used as a part of a normal factual discourse. And it provides different insight, different perspectives, different analysis. At the same time, the second trend we're seeing, which is also interesting, has been the acceptance of non-traditional, computational, or simulative research as empirical evidence. So if you look at, for example, the growth of predictive analytics, the growth of computational astrophysics, what we see is an acceptance in science of evidence treated as fact that is derived from simulations and not from empirical real-world data. And that distinction is very important because it points to a future where if we really are going to have successful interstellar technology, education, and civilization, it will have to treat convergence as a part of ordinary life. And I think that if I can summarize what this really means, it's this, that convergence is a positive thing from a perspective of utility. We're not looking at this from a discourse perspective or from a power perspective. We're simply saying, hey, it's useful because we're dealing with things that are so unknown to us and so weird and so different that maybe that search for certainty is not as important as our desire to, or as our need really, to change things or fix them or understand them. And certainty is, in some instances, giving way to utility as a model.
I see. So, and if you just briefly, in few words, say what's the relevance, the key, the importance, the most important.
For scholars today, I think the key takeaway is that they need to reevaluate to a certain extent, the traditional structures of academic fields of study. And what we see in the US is that there is some evidence that's already happening. For example, the University of Chicago runs a big problems Bachelor's of Science degree, which is inherently interdisciplinary. But what we see is this very initial attempt to really cross field boundaries and focus more on utility as opposed to formal academic systems. So it's not that I'm getting a BA in economics or a BS in natural sciences or physics or whatever it is. It's that I'm looking from a very utilitarian perspective and I'm saying, hey, there are certain problems across different fields that have similar properties. Let me make my specialty, my area of expertise, the analysis of those problems at that level. And this is a good initial step. So I think that universities need to have at some point a discourse internally about how they treat fact and fiction and what they see as reasonable outcomes.